CBS News legal analyst Rikki Klieman is joining us. And Rikki, the defense has rested. We heard they were going to call two people. They only called one.
They called one because apparently the one could solve the issue that they wanted, which was to give a contrast or inconsistencies to the testimony of both Fuente's brothers. And that's what they got. The distinction, though, cannot be lost on the jury. You had 11 weeks of testimony, 56 witnesses from the government. You had one witness from the defense for 30 minutes. So it's very difficult for a defense lawyer to be able to make a jury understand that the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt on the prosecution. The defense does not have to offer any evidence or could offer a little bit of evidence. I was always a fan of offering no evidence unless I really had a full-blown defense. But when you're testing the government's evidence in a normal case of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, you usually have a fairly decent argument to say you might think he's guilty, guess he's guilty, suspect he's guilty, even believe he's guilty. But unless you believe it beyond a reasonable doubt, you cannot convict. And that's what it means with the verdict is guilty or not guilty. It is not guilty or innocent. That argument goes nowhere in a case like this where the evidence is so overwhelming, both in quantity and, frankly, in quality. You've got photographs here. You have bricks of cocaine, encrypted messages, tape recordings, letters, in addition to all of the cooperating witnesses. It really defies imagination to imagine that they could not get to a guilty verdict on some, if not all, of these counts.
So then I guess it all comes down to the closing arguments for the defense, right? To point out what you have pointed out, that what their burden is versus what the prosecution's burden is. That's a lot. That's a lot of pressure.
Well, it's a lot of pressure on the defense. In closing arguments, it is often said that a case cannot be won in closing arguments, but it could be lost. And what that really means is that it may be all on the prosecution's side going into the closing, and the difficulty may be for the prosecutor to make all of this testimony, 3 months, 10 weeks of testimony, into a coherent story that actually makes sense in a way that is not all over the planet. And so one of the ways that they can do that is with charts and graphs, in addition to the fact that you don't really want to argue a case for 5 or 6 hours. You really want to argue a case so that the jury can go out and say, see, that this is what the prosecutor said and this is what we have to follow. There's an interesting little wrinkle here about closing arguments and into jury instructions and verdict. Ordinarily, you would have the charge conference, that is the instruction conference today. The evidence is closed. You would have closing arguments tomorrow and then instructions, which brings me to Thursday, and the jury would immediately start deliberating. Apparently, at least according to our reporting, that there is a conflict for a juror, and I think it's 2 alternates, but at least more than 1 juror, about Friday. So you don't want to force a jury into trying to deliberate this case in 1 day. So it is possible that the judge could halt deliberations and start them on Monday rather than give them 4 days off once they've started deliberations. We don't know what Judge Kogan is going to do, but that Friday does create a wrinkle.
Interesting.
So just stepping back, sort of big picture,
Sure.
The idea that if El Chapo is convicted, that he goes to prison, this drug cartel, the Sinaloa continues.
Yes.
The drugs are still pouring into this country.
I mean, someone's running the Sinaloa cartel right now, which is part of what the defense, presumably, will also
going to argue. And it just sometimes sort of boggles the mind, the millions of dollars. I'm not saying that justice should not be served, but ultimately, what is the point of this justice when it comes to this cartel?
Well, I think there is a point of this justice, even though I have said that in many ways this is a show trial.
You did say that, yeah. And I'm thinking about that. That's why I sort of remember your words about why we're hearing all this, we're seeing all of this when you...
Well, does it really, in the end, make a difference to the ultimate importation of drugs into the United States of America, whether it's through the Sinaloa drug cartel or some other cartel? Or The fact that El Chapo would get life in prison and have to go to Supermax in Colorado, where he would be locked up in a cell and really basically not see another human being for the rest of his life. He's, I think, 61 years old. In today's world, you could
35
live,
years, yeah.
you could live certainly easily till 90. Does this have any deterrent effect on people who are in the drug business? Do we know? We don't know. Do we hope? We hope. Because it's one thing for someone to go to Supermax, which is probably one of the most challenging prisons in America, and know that they're going to be there for a few years. But to know they're going to be there for the rest of their lives, does it send a message to El Mayo, whose brother testified, whose son testified, the son, the heir to the Sinaloa drug cartel, who says, I don't want any part of this anymore. I lived large. I've had enough. I'm working with the government now. Nodded off to, gave him the sign to El Chapo, this is the way it ends, my friend. Is there a point of El Mayo continuing this, having to live as a fugitive for the rest of his life? What are all those millions, if not billions of dollars doing for him as he goes from hut to hut in hiding? Well, it may just be the life. And it's the life that these people have chosen to live, or maybe it was chosen for them. If you look back at the history of the Sinaloa drug cartel, you were dealing with basically a farmland community of very, very poor people, and who started to grow marijuana and who wound up growing some of the best marijuana in the world. And they were importing that into the United States, and they had a very good business, and they didn't really have the interest of the United States in stopping them because it was marijuana after all, I'm saying in quote. But once Feliz decided to become the head of the Sinaloa drug cartel and move from marijuana in the 1980s into the cocaine business and do business with the Colombians, both with Pablo Escobar and the Cali cartel. At that point, the business changed. And then you wind up with the stupidity, let alone the violence, of the people involved in the Sinaloa drug cartel, of kidnapping, capturing, torturing, and killing a DEA agent, Rikki Klieman. Once Camarena was killed, all gloves were off. And the United States was not going to stand for one of their own agents being killed simply by being a good investigator into the Sinaloa drug cartel. And that's when everything changed. If they had stayed in the marijuana business, they probably would be no problem.
And it's a good point to point out, as we cover this trial, we'll never know how many lives, but certainly hundreds of lives that have been ruined, and in many instances families who've lost loved ones because of the result of this decision that was made to go from what some people might say is just marijuana to...
And terrible. I mean, it is difficult to believe when the things that you read, when you look at what happened here in the wars of the cartels, they were beheading people and leaving their bodies in the street. The wars that went on as a result, particularly to control the plazas, which was the name that is given for the place where the drugs come and then go into the United States of America. The wars to control the plazas, the amount of deaths they had, and deaths by torture, and families afraid to go out of doors. People who were courageous enough in many ways to take them on, the newspaper reporter who is tortured and killed, the police officials who were honorable, who are tortured and killed. It's really beyond our ability to comprehend, unless, frankly, because we can't even get it by watching the trial. You really can only get it by watching something like the Netflix series, reading Cartel, and you're breathless that this could be true. And it's all true.
It's such a great point, Rikki, too, that you make, which is that, we talk about what is the point of putting this man in prison if these heinous acts will continue, the business of dealing drugs in that country, in this country, in the rest of the world continues. But It's something that, I mean, we're probably getting into a Zen discussion here about justice, but it almost is, if he's the personification of this evil, of these horrible and heinous acts that he committed on other human beings, then he has to go down.
Well, but he's also responsible.
Yeah.
You know.
Well,
allegedly,
he was the head of this.
But the testimony is that he ordered these murders. And in some cases participated in the murders. And so, just on that level, beyond the organization, a guy like that should go to prison.
Right.
Well, there's no doubt about it, though the judge keeps reminding the prosecution throughout this trial that this is not a murder case and then there's a story about drugs. It is a drug trafficking case and then there's some murders. And there is no primary count of murder in this case. However, there is a conspiracy to murder, quote unquote, violation, which goes beneath the RICO count, when they have to look at all of the violations in order to decide if there is a RICO conviction. And RICO, for our viewers, is the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, which really means running a criminal enterprise. I think we find El Chapo's story fascinating. I think that it has been a case well tried by the prosecution. I think you also have to consider about the cooperation, extraordinary cooperation, of federal law enforcement agencies in bringing this case to trial. You had not only DEA and the FBI, but you had law enforcement from different countries. You had indictments in various cities throughout the United States of America. And all of these people came together to tell one cohesive, coherent story instead of having 8 or 9 or 10 separate stories, which I think really we ought to give credit to the Department of Justice for having the real strength to make this into one case.
Really great insight as always, Rikki. We'll be looking to see what happens with the jury over the next couple of days, and of course you'll be back here to talk about that. Thank you.